Today on the Roundhouse, we're talking to the composer of a classical piece that combines documenting a railroad's history. All aboard!
In days past, the roundhouse was where the railroad worker united with the steam locomotive, each to prepare for the journey ahead. Today, it's where we examine the history, the industry, the machines, the hobby, and the passion behind railroading. News, interviews, stories, and more. So climb aboard. This is The Roundhouse.
Welcome to the Roundhouse. I'm your host, Nick Ozarek, and this is episode number 140 of our Trains and Railroading podcast, where we're talking about everything in the industry and the hobby, you name it, and we discuss it. Today, we are talking to Mark Rheaume. He is the composer of That's the Way the Railroad Went, which is a classical piece about a tiny little short line in Iowa. It combines music and railroads and documenting history, and it sounds like it was made for me, and maybe it was made for you. I do have a link to it in the show notes for this, or you can search for it on YouTube and listen to the 38-minute piece. I do recommend checking it out in advance of this conversation because we do reference it in places, but if you check it out after the fact, that's fine too. The Roundhouse is a Streamliner Media presentation. Streamliner Media is my company where I produce digital media, especially video, to help you to market your business, tourist railroad, museum, nonprofit organization. I'm a storyteller. It's what I do, and I want to help you out. You can reach out to me at streamlinermedia.com. I want to thank patrons on Patreon who are supporting the Roundhouse. For as little as $1 a month, you are going a long way to making this show possible. So thank you for your support at patreon.com/the Roundhouse. And I want to thank the Mechanical Services Department of the Strasburg Railroad for sponsoring this episode. Learn more at mechanical.strasburgrailroad.com. Our guest today is the composer of That's the Way the Railroad Went, which is part classical music and part audio documentary. Please welcome to the Roundhouse, Mr. Mark Rheaume.
Hi, Nick. Thanks for having me.
You reached out to me about this, and from musician to musician, I'm always interested to see what people do musically with trains and railroads. This was beyond anything I could have even imagined. So let's just start with what is That's the Way the Railroad Went?
Oh gosh, this has had a lot of different answers over the gestation of the project. This is a 40-minute piece of music that tells the oral, that's O-R-A-L, and the aural, A-U-R-A-L, story of the Central Iowa Railway Company. It's a very short-lived short line out here in central Iowa. I interviewed a bunch of people who had amazing things to say about this railroad. It ran back in the early 1970s, and I wrote this piece for my dissertation project here at the University of Iowa.
An unusual piece, a mixture of oral and oral, or is it oral and oral?
Sure.
One order of that. So much to explore with that. Going back to the beginning, how did you develop an interest in trains and railroads?
Oh gosh. Well, I grew up near St. Louis, and there we would watch. My dad would take me out to see the CSX train stop by, and we'd count all the auto cars as they came into St. Louis. So I just always loved trains, and well, I shouldn't say always. There was a time when I didn't. When I was a teenager, I sort of forgot and that I ever liked trains. And sometime after I got married and we moved out to Iowa, my wife and I, to go to school, and I realized I actually do like trains. And the Iowa Interstate drove right by our house, and I said, "Gosh, I really like those. I want to know more about it. I want to know more about like the local railroad that comes through my town." turns out we have two railroads that come through Iowa City, and I've been a rail nut ever since.
Usually being a quote unquote rail nut means, okay, so you go into the photography side of things, you go into the modeling side of things. Music sometimes, postmodern classical music is a rarity. I think it's safe to say. How did you develop your interest in music over the years?
Oh, I've been a musician since I was in fifth grade. I started by playing the trombone, um, and I studied trombone in college as an undergraduate. I specialized in French conservatory music on the trombone, and at a certain point after graduating, I realized I actually preferred writing music to playing it. I thought that was more fun. I usually had more to do, and so I ended up getting into graduate work, master's, and then a PhD program uh, writing music. Um, uh, as as much as I could, really. I would love to do photography, but I know so many of the guys out here in Iowa, and they're always taking the most gorgeous pictures of the railroads that come through. If there's a steam train that comes through, or a neat diesel engine, and they take such wonderful photos that I feel like I don't have to. I just stand there. I don't even get out my phone to take a picture. I just know that I get to see a gorgeous photo when I get back on Facebook. And I feel the same way sort of about of modeling as well, that our local model railroad club is so fantastic. I might as well just go there and enjoy the work that those fellows do. And so music was kind of my way to contribute. It's at least the thing I know best.
What are the musical influences that have shaped your exploration?
Tons. Directly related to this project, though, there is this fantastic piece by a composer named Steve Reich. He's a minimalist composer, and his piece, Different Trains, is a piece that I think actually most of your listeners might really enjoy. Um, it is, gosh, it must be 40 minutes piece for a string quartet and fixed media recording of people talking about their memories of trains. So he wrote this back in late 80s, I think. Um, and it very slowly tells the story of, in very small bits, it tells the story of trains during the golden age of passenger trains in the 1940s. And at the same time, it tells the story of the trains that took um, the victims of the Holocaust to the concentration camps. And so he's interviewing people who remember the things like the Daylight Express, and then he's also interviewing people who survived Auschwitz. And so that's how you get the title, is Different Trains. Um, uh, going back and forth and having this really complicated relationship with trains as an instrument of amazing things and also terrible things. Those things done by humans, by the way, not by the railroads themselves. Um, and so that was a huge influence for me. I realized with this piece that you could tell a story um, using music and by interviewing people. And immediately I thought, do I have a railroad around me that I could tell its story? And could I tell it a little differently? Steve Reich uses, like I said, lots of little bits. So people say one or two words at a time. And they don't say very much. But I had this sense that I wanted to tell a whole lot more like a sonic documentary, as much as I could, so that the piece itself sort of served as the paper, the large book, the tome that many dissertations create. So that was like maybe one of the big jumping off points for me, was that particular piece of music, Different Trains. And then in addition to this, I happened to be listening. I actually remember exactly where I was, Nick, when I came up with the full idea. I was listening to the Roundhouse podcast, believe it or not. Um,
No.
I was. It was the episode where you're talking about the ski train, um, the Colorado ski train. And so I was sitting in a car. This is like during the pandemic, and I was waiting outside of a doctor's office in the cold, and I was listening to that. And again, I thought, well, the ski train is what we were using for the Hawkeye Express, which is a different story altogether. It's this train that we used to run back and forth for the University of Iowa football games. And we would transport people, gosh, maybe 8 miles or something like that, back and forth for all the games. And it used to be the ski train that would come down from Colorado and then transport people here for football games before heading back to Colorado. And so I was thought to myself, oh, what if there's a story there? And then like the pieces really started to fall together, and I realized I could tell a story about a local railroad, um, so that I could do all the field work myself. I could go and talk to people who actually remembered it, and I could set foot. I could just stand, where the rails used to be, and I could use music to tell that story.
Fascinating. Well, you humble me. You humble me twice. You humble me because of that. You also humble me because you say you started music playing trombone in the fifth grade. I started playing trombone in the fourth grade.
Oh, really? I didn't realize you were a fellow trombone player.
How did you first discover the existence of the Central Iowa Railway Company? And perhaps you could explain a little bit for folks who aren't used or familiar with it, because honestly, I wasn't familiar with it before you introduced me to it.
Oh, well, when I first started, I thought maybe no one was familiar with it. Um, and maybe there aren't that many, relative to the Union Pacific or something like that. This is a very obscure railroad. And for me, when I'm doing research, the more obscure, the better. Um, I first discovered the Central Iowa Railway Company, which we can shorten to CIRC if you like. That was the reporting marks they went by. Um, I first discovered it when I was researching the Krandik. Now, the Krandik is the short line that goes right through the University of Iowa's campus. The Krandik stands for, it's CRANDIC. It stands for Cedar Rapids and Iowa City Railway. It was an electric interurban trolley line back from the 1900s to the 1950s, and then they dieselized to save money, and they became a freight. And they still run today, and they still run through campus every once in a while. And there's a group of us, maybe 3 or 4 Hawkeyes, who keep an eye out for the Krandik, and we text each other when the train's coming through town. So I was researching the Krandik at the time. I had not seen the train come through, and I was teaching at the University of Iowa. I was trying to show my students that research could be fun and interesting, and you could genuinely learn something from research. I think if most of your listeners think back to a research paper that they've written at some point, maybe in college or in high school, maybe they're thinking, oh, like you pull up a couple of books, and kind of compile some things together. And I was trying to show students like we could actually learn something about like the world that we live in, maybe something that most people don't know. So as I was researching this, I went to the Hawkeye Model Railroad Club, which is my local railroad club, an incredible layout that they had, and they're rebuilding right now in a new building. And I talked with their vice president, who invited me over. Tom Pursoon is his name, and Tom's been watching the Krandik for years and years and took pictures, and he shared a bunch of Polaroids with me. And hidden in this packet of Polaroids was blue locomotive. Now the Krandik is gold, and actually they're Union Pacific colors is what they are. They're yellow and red, or they used to be, at least at one time. And so it had this blue locomotive on the Polaroid there, and the locomotive was marked J33-3. That was the marking on the side of this locomotive. Very odd to see a letter, much less a dash, included with a number, on the side of an SW1 locomotive on a little switcher. So I asked him about it, and Tom said, "Oh yeah, well, this is part of the old railroad that used to run out to Kelowna." And Kelowna is there's a lot of Amish communities in the area of Iowa, near Iowa City, out in the fields. Some of them are the Amana colonies, or Kelowna, are two like big meccas uh, of that population. And I was just amazed that there was a railroad out there. And I thought to myself, I gotta go. Like, I didn't realize there were tracks out there. But of course, they've been gone. They've been gone for 50 years now. They disappeared in the 1970s. So again, I was doing this research on a Krandik, and I found this photo, and I filed that away in the back of my mind as like, that's an interesting thing I need to know more about later on. And again, when I started thinking about writing about a railroad, and writing about a story while composing my dissertation, I thought this could be the chance where I really could dig up something that tells more about this railroad than the exceptionally short Wikipedia article, which is like the only thing that I could find. And all it said was, yeah, it ran about in the 1970s, and they had a locomotive, and that's it. And so that's how I found my way to the the CIRC.
Once you found your way there, given that there was such a short Wikipedia article as a starting point, what did you find?
I found out that there's a wealth of knowledge about this railroad. It's just not where academics are trained to look. So it's not in a book. There's no book on the shelf about it. There's barely access to newspaper articles about it as well. Even the Wikipedia article, the things it cited, I couldn't recreate. I couldn't go find them necessarily. So I had to turn to much more local sources. So someone like Tom, I said, well, what do you remember about it? And he said, oh, I've got, I remember shooting photos of it a couple of times when I was here and there, and when I got repainted. I started canvassing Facebook, all of the small railroad groups, things like the Iowa Railroad Group or the Krandik Railroad Group, and even some bigger groups. I started just asking, like, hey, I'm doing my dissertation. Does anyone know anything? I'll talk to you about if you know anything about this railroad. And then the last place that I really did some digging was at the Iowa State Historical Society, which is a large state-funded, not large, it is a very nice state-funded research area that, again, pulls a lot of information from books and retains a lot of nice records, but it also is kind of this nexus of community kind of scholars, right? People who maintain a kind of oral tradition about the railroad, and so that's how I mostly got started.
Where did the interviews come from that you include in the piece?
Most of the interviews are ones that I conducted myself. I walked around with several microphones and a big notebook, and met up with, gosh, I think I must have talked to about 9 people, I think. And the shame is I could have talked to way more, but you have to sort of put a limit on yourself to get a project done on any kind of deadline. Otherwise, I'd still be talking to people to this day. And so I met with 9 people. I don't know if they want me to mention their names, so I'll just say I met with someone who was a brakeman on the railroad back in the 1970s. He went on to work at the Rock Island Railroad. I talked to one of the men who actually ran this railroad, like who owned it. He was one of the financial officers for this railroad. I talked to him and his wife and his son about their memories about it. I talked to some actual just rail fans, just people who remembered seeing the railroad and kind of wondering where it went. Talked to people at the very end of the line who were sort of my liaisons to the very end of this line. By the way, it went from Iowa City all the way out to Montezuma, Iowa, which is about 70 miles of track. Quite a ways out there. And these are communities that are linked by pretty rough county roads these days. But back in 1970 and before that, it was the Rock Island that used this as a branch line. They call it the Montezuma line. You can actually find some fantastic footage of the Montezuma line on YouTube from some people who I interviewed and talked to. And it's just it's incredible. I never thought I would find half as much as I did. I thought I would find a couple of photos and talk to some people who sort of remembered it. I didn't realize I would talk to rail fans who at the time were perhaps unknowingly documenting something that was about to disappear. I'll just say that as a lesson to any rail fan who's out there who thinks like, oh, no one's really looking at the pictures I'm taking or anything like that, or it seems like no one cares about the railroad that I'm interested in. But you are single-handedly documenting something that no one else is, and that's vital work to preserving history and culture and a way of life. And so to anyone out there who feels that way, please keep doing what you're doing, and someone like me will track you down someday and interview you. I promise.
Everything that we are doing today will become history eventually. The key is just what becomes history that is sought after in our current future. And we have no way of knowing that. So we have to treat it all as if somebody is going to place great emphasis on it, because you just never know.
Yeah, I think you're right.
The Strasburg Railroad is an institution in the heritage railroad industry, and its mechanical services department is proud to lead the way. With the knowledge and experience that has created one of the most reliable steam railroading experiences in the country, the Strasburg Railroad is excited to offer their expertise to the rest of the industry. Strasburg's professional team provides consulting and technical assistance to take your steam locomotive or rail car project from idea to finished product. They stand behind their work and always strive to meet their customers' needs for quality, historic accuracy, and reliability at a price that is fair. Unlike many competitors, they feature a fully equipped boiler, rail car, and machine shop, so the work gets done in-house, helping you get more for your money. Send your inquiries to mechanical@strasburgrailroad.com and let the professionals get to work for you. We should probably establish what led you to embarking on this as a research project and creative exercise.
Well, to get a PhD, at least from the University of Iowa, you need to write a significant piece of music. And if that sounds vague, it is. Most of my colleagues write phenomenal, wonderful pieces for a chamber orchestra, a very small orchestra. I knew that if I was going to write a piece for an entire year, I was going to spend 12 months working on one single piece. It needed to be about something I really cared about and something I could live with. And during my doctorate, it was hard for me to pull myself away from the railroads around me and learning more about them and doing a little bit of modeling myself too. So I knew it was something that I could sustain myself on for a long time, and I would never mind doing that kind of research. And so that's actually the main reason is that I chose a railroad of any subject to write a piece about, was just so that I would stay interested in it, and so that it was something that I really cared about. That said, when I was pitching this to my faculty and, getting the piece approved, and they said, well, why are you writing about a railroad? And so I told them what I just told you. But then I had to come up with a couple more things there on the kind of on the fly, which are true. I just hadn't thought of them before as good enough reasons. There's, I think, an important part of Iowa history that's tied with the railroad history. And there's also an important part of, I feel like we're missing this a lot these days, which is like a recognition of how tied together the rural and the urban communities are. Even in an area like Iowa, which your listeners might be imagining flat cornfields. It's not. It's a little more interesting than that. There's a couple of hills every once in a while. But we have large cities and we have large areas of farming country. And both politically and culturally, we tend to see the other as the other, right? There's the red conservative farmland, and there's the generally blue cities. And especially these days, it feels like there's more and more of this kind of separation between those two things. When I was researching this railroad, what I realized was there used to be a literal lifeline between these communities and the cities. That actual steel rail connected these towns in a way that county lines don't represent, that roads don't show. But whenever you saw the Rock Island roll past your house, you knew that it was eventually going to end up in Iowa City, in Cedar Rapids, and in the same way that you knew when you sent out your boxcar out to Montezuma, it was going to pass through all those towns as well. So I think that is also like just a great reason to research these things, just like from a sense of trying to understand where my community kind of comes from and our shared history, and realizing that we share a lot more than maybe the news would lead us to believe.
One of the many things that I really loved about it is that you're telling this history, but you're unlocking the emotional attitudes that go with the rise and fall and rises and falls subsequently. How did you determine the structure? You've collected these interviews, you've got the overall story. In your mind, how did you start to piece together the different moods that you were going to be traveling through, and how much to linger on each of those moments?
That's a great question. This is the hardest part. Interviewing people was easy. Writing music was easy, like relative to what I had to do here, which was compiling. I think I collected maybe 12 hours of interviewing. And I had to clean all of that audio and set about transcribing it. And then I had to decide how any of these pieces work together. And this took me months to just moving blocks of audio around on my computer to see how it would go. I had a plan to begin with. I abandoned that plan pretty quickly because when you're doing these interviews, you don't really know what people are going to say, let alone how they're going to say it. Which, when you're paying attention to speech melody, like we had talked about earlier, and you're paying attention to how people are saying it, and even like what pitches they're saying, all of a sudden you become beholden to a lot more than just the content of their words. And so if someone says something, says a word at a certain pitch, and someone says a different word at a similar pitch, and you think, oh, that can make a melody together, or those are related somehow harmonically, and they could maybe work together. All of a sudden, those two pieces kind of belong together. Excuse me, even if they didn't beforehand. And so I had to just do a lot of shoving around. I'd say one of the most important rules that I set down for myself was separating the speakers, like interweaving them as much as possible. I didn't want to have the situation where someone, like one voice, is talking forever and ever and ever about one thing. Mainly to show that this is an interwoven narrative. And it's not that you can't trust one voice, but rather, one person saw one thing, and then some people saw something that maybe contradicted it. And I didn't want to let one just become the dominant voice amongst all the others. And so I spent most of my time kind of planning out, who hasn't spoken in a while, who can I tap to talk about, subject A or subject B. And at the end, I'm not even sure that I'm entirely happy with where everything ended up or the spacing or anything like that. But that's art for you. Like you're doing your very best.
From one artist to another, you're always going to find things you could pick apart, things that you go, oh, I could do that better, especially as you grow as an artist. That, I feel, is always part of the territory.
For sure.
It's interesting to hear you talk about how, based on not just the content of what somebody's saying, but how they are saying it, that influenced the music that surrounded that voice, or that would transition, and how that would create a transition. Because there's some moments in which you'll take a phrase that somebody says, and this is something that, say, I would never do in the podcast because it's not that type of art form, but repeating it. Like you'll take the end of a sentence and you'll just repeat it, and you'll just repeat it like I did right there. It wasn't something that, to me as a podcaster, I'm immediately thinking of the reason behind that. But if you're emphasizing a point in the nature of it as a whole, and there's something to the framing of it that struck you that you wanted to accentuate, I can see the reasoning for doing that.
Yeah, and that's part of that. I had mentioned some of the psychology studies that have been done, and so what they found is if you repeat a phrase multiple times, said exactly the same, right, or recorded once and then repeated several times, it takes, 3 or 4 times for the average human to notice like what the actual pitches are. And with more training, you can do it a little bit quicker. But that's the exact reason why is so that you can say, okay, that was an actual like melody there. And hopefully, as you listen to the piece, you can start to hear more of those melodies without the orchestra kind of telling you what those melodies are. So the piece starts off with, you hear the saxophones play a melody, and then you hear the voice say that melody. And it's very structured like that. And by the end of the piece, 40 minutes in, the orchestra is not doing nearly that much work anymore. And the human voice, the recorded human voices are becoming kind of instruments of their own at that point. And so over 40 minutes, it, I hope, maybe trains the ear to hear those sounds for their own worth, for their own value. Another
unique choice that you made in constructing this is that, as you say, there's a number of voices that we hear throughout, and most of the voices on some newsreel clips that you use are from these interviews. These are people that you talk to, and yet we're pretty much never introduced to who these people are. There's never a moment in which they say, "Hi, I'm John Smith, and this is my specific connection to the railroad." They just come in to the piece as if in a play. They just walk in and they start talking about whatever their experience is. I have some guesses as to the reason you chose that and some interpretations of that, but I'm curious to hear what your methodology was there.
In some ways, it's just protecting the identity of the people who were being interviewed. Some of the things that my subjects talked about were uncomfortable, and I should mention, like, the CIRC failed. It got dismantled. It is a fallen flag, and that doesn't happen without, like, people being hurt, financially and emotionally, and things of that sort. And so some of it was just kind of protecting folks from from some of that. In other ways too, I think it kind of doesn't matter who says something. There's this sense of, I hope, the sense of just kind of a community coming together and saying something, and almost being anonymous just by virtue of being a part of a crowd. I think those are my reasons. What are your reasons, Nick? What do you think? I should.
What I loved about it, one of my philosophies of storytelling is that the story should be about something specific and about something bigger than what it's about. There's the text and the subtext. Here's literally what's going on, and what is the larger purpose? What are the themes that this is exploring? Because to me, that's how you balance a story being about something specific, especially if you're conveying a piece of history, but also being relatable. What's the entry point for the audience? I know in classical music, there's differing opinions about whether or not the audience needs to or should be part of the conversation, art for art's sake kind of thing. But because you are telling a story, I think it's beneficial that there is that relatable quality. And for me, as somebody who adores short lines, past and present, I think there's so much character to them that while these people are talking about this specific line, there's elements of what they're saying that for me relate to the national picture. You could take certain snippets of what they say and apply that to the thousands of lines that have disappeared from this country. And I think that those of you who listen to this, you'll probably have a short line or some neighboring railroad that comes to mind for you when you hear about the rise and fall elements of this. And I like that because I think that it makes it relatable. It's not, you have to be an Iowan to get it. You just have to have lived life and pay attention to history enough to see the parallels. That's what it did for me anyway. So I'm curious as to if that hits the mark of part of your intentionality. As you say, sometimes with these things, as a creator, as a director, an artist, you're making choices because that's the practical thing you have to do. But it's always convenient when people can read a subtext into it.
Yeah, I like your answer better.
And speaking of reactions, I'm curious as to how things were received. I mean, you informed me that you got your PhD, so congratulations on that. So clearly they liked it to some extent, but I'm curious as to some of the specific pieces of feedback that you received either from within your institution or from those who participated.
Yeah, well, I cared the most about what my interviewees thought about the piece, and I had a great time sending it out. By the way, the recording that is linked there in the YouTube, it's a mock-up. It's made by electronic instruments that sound okay. They're close enough to what a saxophone quartet and a string quartet sound like, because it hasn't been played by real humans just yet. So I wanted to send that out to many of my interviewees as soon as possible, and many of them wrote back and have loved it. I haven't heard anything bad, which at least not from the interviewees, which I think is good. that's a good sign, perhaps, or maybe they're being very kind. We call that being Iowa nice, by the way. If you just don't say the mean thing that you have to say. As far as the dissertation itself, I had a wonderful committee of a very kind and very knowledgeable professors, many of whom were our music history professors, and others who are composition professors. And they had a lot of questions about the process and why I made all of these kinds of decisions. And ultimately, we were sort of talking at the end of the project. You have to do this big defense of your dissertation, and at the very end of it, we were sort of talking about what to actually do with all of the parts of my work. There's the piece of music itself, and then there's a large document that must be it's just shy of 400 pages long. That includes the score itself, but then also a lot of text that talks about how I wrote it. And then there's even another part of it that just documents everything I learned about this railroad. And so in some ways, I'm like, we were talking in the defense about should I just also write a book in addition to it? Who would want such a thing? I don't know. Anyone who cared about the railroads probably just heard the piece. But when you've assembled that much information, and found lots of maps and pictures and wonderful things like that, there's a part of me that wants to kind of still do that.
You're going to start having a larger audience for this too, in part because we're recording this in late November of 2023. And as I understand it, it's going to be making its live orchestra debut in February of 2024. Is that correct?
Gosh, I hope so. We haven't officially cemented that yet. But a live performance should be coming at some point. Certainly we'll re-record it and perform it. And it's part of the mission, not only of the University of Iowa, but of our music department too, to be really good stewards of not only of our craft of making music, but also of sharing that with primarily with the state, which, by the way, pays for a ton of the university and is a big part of subsidizing my education and my current employment too. And so serving the community, sharing this research with the wider community is a part of that contract. And so that's why I'm so excited to share it with the audience of the Roundhouse, and with anyone who stumbles upon my YouTube page, which is it's not much of a YouTube page, but there it is. Let's hit 1K, everyone. Subscribe, like, smash that subscribe button. But just getting that information out to as many folks as possible is a big part of, again, connecting the academy, large universities, with the people who help make it possible.
I'll tell you what, Mark, you might be joking about your tongue in your cheek about the whole like, comment, subscribe thing on YouTube, but I finished listening to that and my immediate mental reaction was, when's the next episode coming out? What's the next railroad to be covered? Do you think you would actually do more, recognizing that this was a massive amount of work and not something that you could just blink and put another episode out next month? Is it something that you would replicate with another railroad, potentially even somewhere else in the country?
I would love to. I learned a lot in this process, and I could do it faster these days. And definitely, I would just say I'm for hire. I'm ready to work. No, really, if anyone has a great lead, some other kind of project, if it's railroad related, that's awesome. And if it's not, I would love to help document, any part of history, and help write some music for you. So, yeah, please hit me up if that's something that you're thinking.
This is the significance, I think, of what you've begun to explore. When we think of documenting railroad history, all of which is important. So this isn't to talk about what's better or worse. It's just to explore the different types of documentation. But historically, you're talking books, magazine articles, so a lot of written word. You have some degree of oral history. I'd like to think that that's something that we're accomplishing through this podcast and other recorded histories that go into museums. You have film, you have photography, but music, I think what I loved the most about your piece, Mark, is that I felt something. I can't tell you how many dry railroad histories that I've read. Well researched, very knowledgeable, but I don't get the feeling of what the time was like, what the atmosphere of the area, the railroad culture specific to that line was like. And so you spend enough time in railroad histories, especially if you're a generalist, like I consider myself to be, where I find my interest very nomadic and I'm going from this to that. It's very easy to have it all blend in after a while. What I got from your piece above all else is that I felt something. I felt something about this railroad because you have the music, because you're hearing people talk about it and you're not just paying attention to the specific words, but how they say it and how your music is interacting with that. So we still need the written word, even if it is super dry. We still need that written word. But as a filmmaker, I'm particularly invested in trying to find ways to bring out the emotional history. What were the attitudes? What was the culture like? What was the setting like? And I think that what your piece accomplishes so well, and why I'd encourage people to listen to it, even if it's you listen to the first 5 minutes and you're like, I don't know if this is my thing, it's still worth listening to because it's something different. For me, it made me feel something about this railroad. So it's always going to stick out as this little railroad with this little oddly numbered switcher is going to stick out because I felt something about it. You brought me on this emotional journey with it, which is something that I'd like to see explored with other railroads.
Well, thanks very much, Nick. You're very kind.
As you were going through this process, what surprised you the most about what you were creating?
I think I was most surprised about how willing people were to share their history with me. This is, in a lot of ways, it's very personal kind of stuff. And most people were very, very giving about their personal history, about their memories, about the way that they see the world, which I think is the mark of a good interview, right? Is not someone who is the goal when I'm interviewing someone is not to pry something from them, but rather give them a chance to tell their story. That's the ideal. And so I constantly found myself just amazed as I'd walk out of the library after interviewing someone, and just being sort of floored by like the amount of information that someone knew, and the amount of information that, as you said, like isn't stored in a book somewhere. If I had not just captured it on tape, well, on digital, it would be lost forever. That would be it. And so that's a huge part of the drive of the project, is to really honor that incredible gift from so many giving people. And I suspect, too, that there are many, many more people out there who are just brimming with the that same kind of generosity to tell more of the world about the way that they've seen things happen.
By approaching them and saying that your perspective matters. I think that's so important. The fact that these people that you're interviewing, I could imagine that some of them may not necessarily be shy, but just not necessarily recognize the value of their experience, even if it's just, oh, I just lived across the street. My role perspective to this is minimal compared to people who worked on the line or so forth. But there's value in that perspective. There's so much more of a whole picture because we have that perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
My last question for you is, at the end of the day, what are you most grateful for in terms of having accomplished this project? Other than, of course, you got a PhD. There is that. But besides that,
I got to learn a lot about a project, a lot about this railroad. And I'm just like really, really grateful that I got to spend this much time just doing this. This was my full-time job for quite a while. And so that's part of like how I was able to invest myself so much in the history and the sounds and pictures and drawings and blueprints and everything like that. And I'm very grateful to my wife who took care of me during that time. And she'd come downstairs. She'd say, "What'd you do today?" And I said, "I don't know. I think I found out they had a caboose. That was a day's work." Which is a ridiculous thing to spend a day doing, but I did. So I'm just very grateful for that. I'm also very grateful, truly, like to everyone who contributed to it, and to anyone who takes a listen and thinks twice about the old railroad tracks that are abandoned, the town over.
Mark, thank you so much for joining us here on the podcast to talk about this work and your process for creating it. It's been great to geek out about music, and I'm looking forward to seeing the live version. Not necessarily version, but hopefully there's a video recording of the live version so that those of us who aren't able to attend can see it performed.
Thanks so much, Nick.
And now, the question of the day.
Last time on the Roundhouse, I asked you guys, going into the new year, what are you most excited about? And I had a lot of interesting responses, a few that I've selected to share with you. From Grant Geist, excited about the third year of the Indiana Rail Experience with Nickel Plate Road 765 and continued progress on steam locomotive restorations, including Reading 2100, Pennsylvania Railroad 1361, 576, and the T1 Trust 5550. Christopher R. Waters also chimes in and says 2100 possibly being up and running. And lastly, apologies if I butcher the name, Daniel Ahadzadeh, Canadian Pacific 2816's return to the main line. I agree with you, Daniel. That's probably my choice as well. I hope I get to see it trackside. That will be fun. Your question of the day for this episode is, what is your favorite musical piece about railroading? Let me know on the roundhousepodcast.com. Links to social media there. Again, if you want to support the Roundhouse, go to patreon.com/the Roundhouse, and every dollar goes to supporting this show and bringing you these interviews, these stories, and this history. Thank you for joining us today, and remember, as always, that the Roundhouse is our house.